month. We have big plans for our store in the future, but for the month of June, we have created our first limited edition Pride Month merch. We cannot say this enough. All net proceeds from the sales this month are donated to charity. Keep an eye out on our social feeds as we'll be introducing more merch for the whole community to enjoy. That's it for now, but you'll be hearing from us again in the not too distant future with another exciting announcement, something many of you have been waiting for. Thanks again for taking the time to keep up to date with what we've got going on. We couldn't do it without you, Ray McCaffrey.
Hello, one person.
So there's just two quick things I want
Probably
to point
Ryan,
out. Interesting that they mentioned DLC. When I read this, I did not expect this to come up, but it looks like they're hard at work on the DLC.
Doing dishes. Oh, person left. It doesn't matter. Bruh. Welcome to my kitchen. My disgusting ass kitchen. Shit's ugly. I know. Hey, Adam in the wild. I'm in the wild, technically, because it's my natural habitat. Bruh, mountain lightning. Sheesh! I think that shit up 2 liters. I'm live. Today is just going to be a random day because I don't post to my YouTube channel often. So I'm just going to live stream my day-to-day, see what random shit goes on. And yeah, all right. Gunner's over there. I'll get the gunner cam set up eventually. We'll get the gunner cam set up eventually. Hey, welcome. I know there's 0 of you here so far, but hey. Future. Now, I don't know. That's bullshit. And now I'm doing dishes and watching some shit.
So a few months ago, we went over one of the fastest speedruns for Cuphead, where you can beat the game in under 20 minutes. And with the upcoming Cuphead DLC just around the corner, I wanted to revisit the base game one last time, and today we're going to be checking out the Army % speedrun, where Cuphead basically invents a cloning device to create an army of mugmans, to absolutely ravage anything and everything that gets in their way to beat the game incredibly fast. And really quick, before we get to the blasting, I'd like to thank Kingdom Maker for sponsoring this video. Kingdom Maker is a free mobile game that combines well without getting into hugs at our disposal. Alright, so seeing all of these clones is cool and all, but first things first, just how do we go about cloning Mugman? Well, without getting into too much technical detail, you can use some third-party software to basically make your computer think one controller is actually 2. Then all you really need to do is pause the game, then remove the second player, and then almost instantly rejoin. There's only like a 2-frame window that you get after removing the second player, so timing can be a bit tricky. I found that basically removing and joining at the same time seemed to work best for me. And yeah,
Yeah,
if
the
you get
front
the timing
cam,
right,
we can have the
bam,
back
we
cam.
just created
Back cam
another
sucks.
Mugman. And you can copy
So-
as many as you'd like, with the only limit being how much your
Oh, that's
PC
when
can
somebody
handle.
gets there.
After a few too many Mugmen, it gets hard to play, to say the least. Unfortunately, these copied Mugmen don't carry over between stages.
we could
You
have
have
kitchen
to
cam.
redo this glitch on
We can
every
have
boss
top
fight
down
you get
here.
to.
We'll do top down cam. Try, at least we'll try. Yeah, no. Top down cam is not working.
Out of the way, let's get to running and gunning. So since we're running the
'Cause we're on a laptop.
you also get access to a bunch of the other exploits we saw in my previous video to save some time. And one of these we get to see right away, as instead of actually having to go through the tutorial section and such, once we load into the room here, we can simply exit the map to completely skip all of it. Then after collecting 3 freebie coins from Applefella here, we get to the first and last run and gun section of this speedrun. For this stage, you don't really want to create any clones, as it will just eat up time, and damage output isn't really that important here, so it doesn't really serve to help much yet. So you just gotta jump and dash through the level and make sure you collect all 5 coins on the way to the end. Now with 8 coins in total, we can pay Porkrind a visit here to purchase 2 weapon upgrades, the Lobber as well as the Roundabout weapon. Now if you've seen my previous Cuphead speedrun video, you probably already know where this is going. So the original pre-packed version of Cuphead actually has an exploit called WSG, or the Weapon Swap Glitch, whereby quickly swapping between both weapon types, you can effectively double your damage output rate. And this actually stacks with each Mugman that you copy. So yeah, you can essentially multiply your damage output by 2, 4, or really however much you want. So this weapon swap glitch, coupled with Cuphead and his pal army of Mugmen, can deal some devastating damage. Now that's a lot of talk building it up, but let's see how it performs as we get to our first battle in this game against the Root Pack. Now one thing I immediately learned is that it's incredibly important to keep track of where all the clones are, as it's really difficult to control all of them without taking damage. So one of the best strategies for this run is to always try to keep the characters as close together as possible.
So
to
today
avoid
we are
sprays
picking up
getting
around the house.
Anyways, with a
And
bunch
we are
of
doing
clones
these
spawned in
fucking
here,
dishes.
they all made quick
What do you
work
mean
of
we
eating the
are?
veggies.
You're here
Basically,
too.
only
Shush.
letting them live
We're
for
doing
2
chores.
minutes each, and thus finishing
Get
the
to
whole
work,
fight in
slave.
just 28 seconds. Next up, we got Ribby and Croak. This fight isn't all too bad, in the first 2 phases anyway, but things get cranked up once reaching the final slot machine section. I kept getting the frogs, or snakes, or whatever these are, resulting in a bunch of spiked platforms coming out. Now, as I mentioned, keeping all the characters as close as possible is very important, so when these get thrown on the field, it's very difficult to keep all the fellas together, and yeah, this just makes it quite challenging. Thankfully, though, we still do a ton of damage, so by hoping that just enough cups stay alive, I was able to squeak my way through this one. Next is Goofy, and this fella, as usual, is incredibly easy. With only a few clones, I was able to finish him off before he was able to even transition to his final phase. And the whole fight, again, took less than half
I
a
start
minute.
streaming on Twitch.
Now, one thing I should bring up here is the time sink from trying to do the cloning glitch. Unfortunately, the time still goes when you pause and try to do the glitch, so any unsuccessful cloning attempts like this one do end up wasting some time. So, for example, in the last fight here, although the fighting only took like 20 seconds, all the failed, wasted attempts did end up adding a decent chunk of time. So in short, although the fights do end up being faster with the higher damage output, the added time from cloning actually doesn't really end up saving any time. Anyways, then after doing another little trick by just exiting to the map here, we can skip having to go all the way to the right of the screen to save a few seconds. And then, just like that, we're on to our first airplane level of this run. Thankfully, our cloning machine is advanced enough to not only clone bugs, but also planes. So in all of these stages, we can multiply our damage output as well. This fight honestly wasn't all too bad, especially since I was able to shoot out several rockets at a time for some devastating damage to Hilda here. On the other hand, though, one bad thing that I noticed in this fight is that when not all of the characters have a Super EX move saved up, If you try to use it and ram into the opponent, the rest of the planes that aren't nukes will still take damage. So yeah, I found it much better to just use the mini rockets instead of saving up for the big nukes. Anyways, with these mini rockets, quickly we can get to the final moon phase, and yeah, pretty easy fight. Next up, we got Plant Boy, and although I thought this fight would be easy, it honestly was pretty challenging. For starters, you have to hit Plant Boy in the top right here, so I tried to stack up my characters on this platform, but it's pretty small, at least for like 6 fellas, so it was pretty tricky to keep all of them together while also dodging the seeds that fall from above and the vines that grow from below. But after focusing everyone together and landing some absolutely gnarly EX hits, Cagney was down for the count, barely being able to even get to his final phase. Now next up is probably my least favorite fight in the game here against Deafy the Clown. And honestly, I found this to be one of the most challenging battles of this run. Not only does Deafy dip around at the start, making it hard to create control, but it also makes it tough to keep them together, which in turn makes it hard to avoid damage from Deafy's acting as well as the stuff above. Things get even more challenging when having to deal with the roller coaster coupled with Deafy's other attacks. Now, for whatever reason, after dying several times, on one attempt, I was able to get Deafy like stuck in between 2 phases. Both the balloon phase and the horse phase were kind of just stuck in the damage state in the middle, and yeah, I could still damage them, so I'm not going to complain. I just fired away, and thankfully, that's a wrap for this fight. Jimmy the Great is next, and although the interface can be kind of difficult with all the garbage being thrown around, after this phase is done, by just spamming some rockets, Puppet and Jimmy won't be a problem for long. Now, interestingly, in this fight, I had so many characters shooting on screen that the stacking of the bullet sound effects seemed to have caused the background music to glitch out too. Crunch attention, Captain. He's a crunch. He's a captain. Time for the classic more adventure. Baroness Von Bon Bon is another really easy fight for this run. All 3 of the minions that start off the fight can be defeated within seconds, and really only the section at the end is a bit tricky. Similar to what we saw with Cagney Coronation, here we just have one platform to deal with in order to keep fire on the Baroness. And since the castle starts moving, it gets a little tricky, but thankfully the damage output makes it pretty quick. And once this fight was done, I ran into yet another weird glitch. The ground under the castle just kept on moving, and it just revealed this dark void under the stage. Pretty weird. Now, although the first 2 airplane levels weren't too bad, the next one here against Wally Warble gets a bit more tricky. Here it's more important than ever to try and keep all the planes close together, as dodging the eggshells, the Fury of Feathers, as well as the orbiting spike eggs can get pretty rough. Now, thankfully, if you manage to get through all of that, you can get to one of the most satisfying sections of all the plane levels here. So since the rockets do more damage to enemies with a bigger horizontal hitbox, with all the planes in the bottom left, the rockets can do some insane damage to Wally in the stretcher here, with each rocket hitting numerous times. Yeah, the whole phase ended up lasting only a few short seconds. Unfortunately, things don't get much easier here in the next fight against Grim Matchstick. Now, single platforms were tricky enough earlier, but here, not only do all of the cloud platforms move, but also if you fall off, you'll almost always take damage to boot. It was incredibly hard to spawn in more clones, as well as keep them together here. So honestly, this was probably the most difficult fight of the run so far when having the clones along. It took me several attempts, but after being able to keep at least a few clones around until the end phase, a few EX attacks quickly put Grim Matchstick to bed. Now on to Inkwell Isle 3, we start things off with yet another pretty tough fight against Rupert Honeybottom. While Grim Matchstick had horizontal moving platforms that made it difficult, here we got vertical moving ones which add a similar challenge to the battle. The worst part was either jumping too high to not see where I was, or getting hit near the top, giving me virtually no time to carry the spirits to bring them back. So yeah, pro tip with all of the clones, stay away from the top of the screen. But devastating wave of lag. Now, next up is probably the most challenging airplane fight of this run, and that probably isn't coming as much of a surprise to you if you've played this game before. Dr. Cull and his robot are pretty ruthless. There's just so much going on all the time. You're almost forced to go up to the top of the screen at the start, and like I said earlier, that's no good. Things don't get much easier in the final phase as you have to constantly dodge a whole bunch of gem blasts in addition to these electrical barrier things. It certainly isn't easy, but if you can lay down enough fire on a crazy doctor, that brings another enemy to deal. Now, after that chain of difficult battles, I'm happy to say that the fight here against Sally Stageplay is thankfully much easier. This is like the first fight in a while where we have some nice, flat, stationary ground. Yeah, Sally is absolutely no match for this barrage of lobby and boomerangy boys. And we can chalk up another fight where I was able to finish it without even allowing the enemy to reach their final phase. When starting the fight against Werner Vermin here, I was actually kind of worried that his rolling around would be tricky to deal with, but I guess with the clone army, I was able to deal enough damage fast enough that there really wasn't much to worry about at all. Yeah, the whole fight was done in like 30 seconds. Captain Grimy Beard is next, and although there isn't much to really talk about in terms of the fight here, when doing my run, this was like the closest I ever came to losing a battle. I basically died and defeated the ship at the same time. Like, there must have been only a few frames difference here. I honestly thought that I lost the battle at first, but thankfully, I guess fortune was in my favor, so I was able to put this battle behind me pretty fast. The fight with Calamaria here is a bit tricky with all the pufferfish and stuff on screen, but honestly, we've seen more difficult airplane battles already, so this one should be a breeze if you manage to get through the other fights before this. Man, I'm telling you, those sack rockets definitely aren't something to mess with. Now for the final overworld boss fight, we got Phantom Express, and yeah, we have another single platform that we have to deal with. Honestly, for this one, I ended up not making too many clones as they were pretty tough to keep together here, at least for the first few phases. But I did end up using some time in between phases to make more clones, and this ended up making the other phases pretty dang easy. That said, the last phase was still pretty tough because it required a lot of movement, which tended to separate the cups from the mugs here. But after a few attempts, that's another battle in the bag. Now with all of those bosses done, it's time to move on to the final stretch and start the fight with King Dice. Now, unfortunately, for whatever reason, the cloning glitch doesn't work properly for any of the fights leading up to and including the King Dice fight. Basically, by activating the cloning glitch here, Mugman ended up just disappearing, and then once Cuphead died, the game just soft-locked. I couldn't move, restart, or even pause to close the game. Unfortunately, I had to restart the entire game, which kinda killed my run, but oh well, let's still power through and finish things off here. So yeah, for this speedrun category, it's best to just battle through all the sub-bosses and King Dice solo. So there's not really crazy for these fights, so let's just skip to taking down King Dice and getting on to the last fight against the Devil. Now, apparently, going through the King Dice fight at all ends up triggering the soft lock glitch on any other fight too. So after restarting the game again, now we can get to the fight with the Devil in Clone Army style. The Army of Bugs made the first phase pretty easy, and after jumping down, I also learned that the game basically resets the protagonist, so all the clones were gone, leaving me to turn on the cloning machine once again. And with a whole bunch of clones, the last phase here was honestly incredibly easy. Like, that was the fastest I have ever gone through the Devil fight. And just like that, that's the end of the speedrun. Now, on my first try, I was still learning the cloning technique, so my time was just under an hour and a half, so nothing special, but this was about half the time it took me to beat the game normally only a few weeks earlier. And my run certainly wasn't anywhere as fast as the current world record holders for this category, GOTGM, where he was able to clear the whole game in only 23 and a half minutes. Anyways, that's speedrunning Cuphead with an army of Bugmen clones, and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, I'll likely be uploading some more Cuphead videos when the DLC drops, so be sure to subscribe to find your way back in the future. And while you're here, check out some of my other speedrunning videos. And as always, gamers, gamers. I will see you in a bit.
It's time to find out who runs this house. Bring the thrill of different sports to life in your home.
Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Lost Bits right here on Tetra Bay Gaming, the series where we take a look at the scrapped, unused, and unseen content in video games. Cuphead is a side-scrolling run-and-gun game in the style of a 1930s cartoon, and it was for sure one of my favorite games of 2017. Thankfully, the game is hosted to a plethora of unused content and horror stuff that I've ever seen. I was going to wait a bit before making this video, but a ton of you guys have been asking me to make it, including Kevin from SMG4 and the Hobo Bros, so here we are. Anyways, without further delay, go grab a cup or a mug. This match is about to get red hot. It's time to find some lost bits. Alright, so what do you say we kick off this video with some unused weapons and charms? There are a total of 5 weapons and 2 charms that ultimately go unused in the final release of the game. First is Arc. As the name implies, projectiles fire in an arc and will then stick to the ground. Soon after hitting the ground, the projectile will grow and will then explode if an enemy touches it. The weapon also has 3 distinct damage values depending on when it hits the enemy. The lowest damage would come just after the projectile hitting the ground, the medium value after it has grown on the ground, and the highest damage would actually occur if the projectile explodes mid-air. When using the EX attack, the weapon would fire out a shot in a downward arc, which would again stick to any surface and explode after a while. Next up is Ranger or Exploder, as it is sometimes referred to in the files. Both names explain half of how this weapon works, as the attack explodes and it does more damage the further the range is. So really, I think it would have made more sense to call it the Ranged Exploder or something. Right away, you can probably tell that this weapon wasn't finished to be used in the final game, as it only uses red circles as placeholders, which grow and then awkwardly explode upon contact. But oddly enough, in the original Cuphead teaser trailer released by the developers, we can see that the projectiles for Exploder, even back then, were already stylized. So it's pretty weird why only the placeholder circles are left over unused in the final release. The EX Exploder attack simply just fires out a fast-moving projectile, which after hitting something, will shoot another projectile back at the player, and oddly enough, it will do damage if it happens to hit you. Kind of a dumb attack, if you ask me. Next is Triple Laser, which is exactly what it sounds like. Although it is one of the weakest weapons compared to all the rest, it is the only weapon that can pass through objects and still damage enemies. Now, whether this is intended or just simply the result of the coding not being complete is still unknown. The triple shot also doesn't have a special EX shot, and Cuphead will just shoot nothing. This suggests that it was scrapped from the game before the EX shot was even programmed at all. There's also a scrapped weapon that would have been used in an airplane level simply called Laser. For some reason, this is the only weapon that I couldn't get to work, but it would basically look just like the starting weapon, but shot from the plane. Its EX special would shoot out several shots in a circle. I'm fairly certain this was just an early version of the normal plane weapon we got to see in the final game before it was properly stylized. The last unused weapon is known as Arcade P-Shot, and it was planned for the also scrapped level called Coin Op Bop, which we will come back to later. When trying to load this weapon in the game, it just straight up didn't work, and after dying, the game accidentally soft locked. So it looks like the Coin Op Bop level was scrapped before this weapon was even fully finished. And next up, we have some unused charms. The first of these was referred to as Turret, and aside from some brief mentions in the game's code, not much is really known about this charm. However, based on its name alone, it's safe to assume that it would probably spawn some independent object that would assist the player in shooting other enemies. The other unused charm was known as Shield. The Shield charm would simply grant the player invincibility for falling into pits, and would also extend the length of the invincibility frames after recovery. Strangely enough, even though this charm is unused, the developers actually nerfed it in one of the game's patches. Now let's move along to the game's unused music and sounds. There are a lot of sound files left over in the game from the 2015 demo of Cuphead, which go unused, but they're mostly like half a second long, so I'll just quickly play through all of them. Similarly, there are also a bunch of unused sounds that sound like they were meant for some of the game's weapons. I'll quickly just run through them all as well. Next are two creepy sounding laughs. They are believed to have been intended for the bomb special attack used in the game's airplane sections. The game also contains sounds for Cuphead and Mugman's intro animations. In the final release, these go unused, and the intro animations are silent. The game also has unused death sounds for Cagney Carnation, or as I like to call him, the first of these is a death sound that would have played for Cagney being defeated in his second phase. This sound was used when defeating Cagney in early demos of the game, but in the final release, Cagney is silenced between the second and third phase. The other unused Cagney sound is believed to be a death sound if defeated in the game's simple mode. As much as I love Cuphead's title theme, in the game's files there is another awesome unused title theme referred to as EDM title screen. This title theme is completely different than the final one used, and it has different words, and it is much more upbeat. Let's have a listen.
And this is how the adventure was born.
I actually really like it. You might have also heard towards the end of the track that the Cuphead lyrics sound basically identical to the sound played in the overworld after completing a level. So I guess at least some part of the unused title theme made its way into the final release. Okay, time to get into some weird stuff. There is an unused sound file referred to as MUS Intro Don't Deal with the Devil Vocal 666, with the 666 obviously referring to the number of the beast from the Book of Revelation. Anyways, this track is the opening theme played in reverse and in a lower pitch. And if that wasn't creepy sounding enough, towards the end of the track you can hear the menacing laughter of King Dice faintly in the background. But wait, there's more. When viewing the latter part of the file as a spectrogram, which is a visual representation of the spectrum of frequencies of a sound, the first phase, transition, and second phase of the devil fight can all be made out. Enough talk, let's have a listen.
Suck. I just found it. No.
For a low auto rate today.
Battle State. Jams.
And speaking of the Devil fight, the game also contains some unused placeholder concept sketches of the Devil. Those sure are some wiggly arms. Other unused placeholder graphics include text for the explosion in the Cagney Carnation fight. They simply say, "This goes boom," and then cloudy, where the resultant smoke would appear. Next is a placeholder graphic called Soul Idol, which would have been used for an enemy that would have appeared in the fight with Mr. Chime. Next is a placeholder sketch of a nun. Now this gets even more interesting, as this nun would have appeared in a normally unused branched path in the fight with Sally stage play. In normal play, after the first phase, Sally would hop in a car with her newlywed husband and drive off to the next phase at their home. Instead, some modification, there's actually a completely unused alternate path in this fight. In a bad turn of events, the groom would have died from the chandelier falling on him, and instead of driving off, Sally would quickly mourn. The fight would then transition to a nunnery. Here the nuns would have thrown rulers at the player for some odd reason. But as you can see, not only are the nuns not programmed in yet, but the rulers default to an also unused image of Jared Moldenhauer, who was the lead game designer for Cuphead. This picture is known as Jareed. Jareed is actually the default for projectile if the intended art is removed. The game actually has several instances of the Jareed head, such as the realistic version, it crossed out, an Illuminati version, one where it explodes, and then there's Jared head, Cuphead's long-lost cousin. Anyways, back at the nunnery, we can also see some unused animations for the priest in the background. The third phase would also be different, as the husband would return, but in an also unused deity form. His attack is simply just holding up some grapes and shooting out a removed projectile in a straight path, which again defaults to Jareed. Surprisingly, this unused husband deity form is still loaded in the final game and can be seen just off the screen. He can even be defeated off screen, however, it doesn't really have any effect. There is another unused attack that can't even be loaded called Shuriken Bomb, that must have been scrapped even earlier in development. It would have just been some curved blades attached to a bomb hanging on a rope. And next up are several levels that were scrapped from the final build. First, there are 4 unused levels that appeared in the 2016 demo of the game. These run and gun stages were known as Woodland Walk, Tricky Thickets, Forest Frolic, and Backwoods Crusade. They all followed a sort of forest theme, and they all used the same enemies seen in the Forest Follies level from the final release. I briefly mentioned it earlier, but there was another scrapped level called Coin Off Boss. As the name and parts of the code suggest, this level would have been based in a sort of arcade. The code also suggests that there would have been different phases in the level with references to classic video games such as Frogger, Space Invaders, and Asteroids. There is also reference to Big Cuphead and Big Mugman. Some fans have speculated that this would have meant that Cuphead and Mugman would sit in front of an arcade cabinet playing the level. A fan had even made a mock-up to show what the level might have been. I honestly think this would have been such an awesome level design.
Big Cuphead. Big Mugman.
Such as the tent which would have been seen in the overworld, as well as an unused Peanut character that would talk about the arcade. The arcade tent looks very similar to a tent seen in Equal Isle 2 in the final release that has the words "under construction" on it. There is also a track titled Coin Off Bob that made its way onto the game's official soundtrack release. Both this and the tents make me think that maybe Coin Off Bob will make a return to the game in the future as DLC. Fingers crossed. So I already mentioned the unused branching path in the Sally stage play fight, but this game also has a number of other boss fights that were removed, some of which can still be accessed in the game's files. First up, as briefly shown in some early beta footage, it appeared like Whoopi Goldberg would duplicate himself and the player would have to go up against 2 of them at the same time. Here we can also see an early design for the health bar, EX meter, a display that shows your weapons, and also a boss timer that goes completely unused. Next up is Toast, who was only seen in very early development, and as you can see, he never really made it past the crude sketches stage. As expected, the fight would involve bread and a toaster. Go figure. Next are 2 scrapped vegetable bosses, both of which are believed to have been intended to be part of the Root Pack boss fight. First is Radish, who has fully named animations and has a complete sprite sheet. With some modifications, some fans have found ways to even load him into the game. This suggests that Radish might have been scrapped much closer to the game's release. The other unused boss vegetable is known as Betty Beat. A number of early sketches for her exist showing how she would enter the boss fight as well as her attacks. It seems that she would reluctantly throw what seems to be her own offspring at the player, and she would cry while doing so. This is pretty morbid, so it makes sense why it was removed. Jelly the Octopus is another unused boss, but he was actually playable at E3 in 2015. He would simply move back and forth and could only be damaged if the player was to parry the pink antenna on his head. The stage for the boss fight was also completely removed, and although its name can still be seen in the files, trying to load it will just softlock the game. Similarly, another boss that appeared in an earlier 2014 trailer, Demon the Bat, was also scrapped. He would have two phases that are known, one flying around and one in which he would open up a coffin and release some smaller bats. Both Demon the Bat and his fight area are similar to that of the devil in the final game. As such, some fans believe that this was the original final devil fight, and since the trailer in which it was shown, it was just reworked into the one we got to see in the final release. Next is probably the most well-known unused boss, simply named the Giant Spider or the Flying Gentleman. Not much is really known about this boss's attacks or phases, and the only thing that is known is that he would have been another flying level boss. Oddly enough, this spider only appears to have 6 legs instead of 8, so maybe the other 2 might have been used in some other aspect in the fight. Next are some of the unused bosses that we can still access in files. First up is Patchy Patchy, or as I like to call him, Robo Squidward. He is a scrapped boss based on a pachinko machine that would have appeared on one of the spaces during the start of the King Dice battle. Patchy Patchy moves around and shoots an unfinished fire beam out of the top of his head. During the fight, balls also drop and start to tilt the platforms, which still have the word placeholder slapped right on them. This is by far the most complete boss fight left over in the game, as the fight is fully coded and Patchy Patchy even has a death animation. Just like many other things, this suggests that he was removed very late in the game's development. When losing the fight, you can also see an unused death quote saying, "Cling, cling, clang, clang, your bell is rang." However, the profile picture is still missing. I'm hoping, just like Coin Op Bob, we will see Patchy Patchy brought back in the future. Now is where things start getting weird. Next up is a scrapped boss area known as Dice Bounce Test. Now, although this area lacks an actual boss, you can see some unused pixel platforms and again some moving heads of Jerry. There is also an invisible platform on the bottom that you can still walk on. When dying at this level to the Jarids, we can see an unused death quote saying, "You are not a warrior, you're a beginner." Fans of Street Fighter will notice that this is a direct reference to Sagat's victory quote from Street Fighter 2. Next up is Hard, an Angry King playing card boss that was also intended to be one of the mini-bosses in the King Dice fight. Judging by all these crudely drawn placeholder graphics, it again seems like this boss was scrapped very early on. Hard also has no hitbox, so to my knowledge, there is no real way to defeat him. As you can see, the different card tiles would fall onto the platform depending on where the player is standing, and then the blocks would disappear if lines are made, kind of like Tetris. The more blocks the platform accumulates, the more it will gradually fall and eventually crush the player. I find it amazing yet strange that we can still find a way to play this stage. And last but certainly not least is the absolute weirdest scrapped boss fight left over in the game, simply known as the Light. This fight consists of a crudely drawn green lad in the middle with some more Doreed head projectiles and some solid colored lines. This honestly looks like the kind of game that someone would make in their first introductory programming class. The rotating blue lines will change to yellow and then to red. However, they will only damage the player when they do turn red. It is possible to defeat this boss, however, he has no included death animation. The fact that this exists and is still playable is absolutely bizarre. Big shoutouts to the developers at MDHR for leaving this fight in the game. And for the last
last off in this video, I was able to access the game's debugging feature, and similarly to games like Sonic Mania, as kind of teased throughout this video, I was able to zoom out the camera and have a look at some of the game's normally unseen content. Now this was really interesting as it revealed many things that the developers had hiding off screen from our view. For example, most boss fights would have all of the currently unused phases loaded just off screen, waiting to be called. For instance, during the fight with Grim Matchstick the Dragon, his alternate appearance behind the player can be seen hiding just off screen on the left. Good thing that we didn't have to fight both of them at the same time. Other good examples include the fights with Rumour Honeybottoms, Becky the Clown, and Jimmy the Great. Some other bosses, namely the ones leading up to the King Dice fight, unfortunately didn't have all too much to see. The run and gun levels, however, were also really cool to zoom out in. We can see that many enemies are called way before appearing on screen, as well as the various visual tricks the developers used in the back and foreground. Once in a while, there would also be an enemy or background object that was just left over off screen by the developers as well, never to be used again. Probably the coolest thing, however, was during the elevator section in the Rugged Ridge level in Inkwell Isle 3. We can see that many objects remained in the same level as the elevator, and they are just brought down with the player to the next segment. It was also really nice to just zoom out of some of the run and gun levels and just have a nice look at the levels in their entirety. And with that concludes this Lost Bits video on Cuphead, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. This game has a ton of stuff that goes unused, so I'm sure there was probably a lot of stuff that I've missed. For more,
my name is Mark Clark. Welcome to Jurassic World Evolution. We're going to play this, and we're going to get some dinos, and they're probably going to kill everybody on the end.
unused, so I'm sure there was probably a lot of stuff that I've missed. For more information about the game's unused content and stuff that I didn't cover in this video, be sure to check out the sources which will be. And here in Blue Bunny, we employ the world's best bunnies to create fun frozen treats for people like you. Who wants to try our new twist on soft serve?
Alright, so first up, just a few cool things that I was able to see when zipping around the camera around the Playtime Company factory here. Firstly, taking the camera just outside the factory where you first start the chapter, I was surprised to see that lettering for Playtime Co. can be seen on the roof. This is pretty standard for a factory, I suppose, but what makes this interesting is that you can never normally see this from the inside. So either maybe at one point in development, the plan was for the player to see the factory from the outside at some point, or the developers just went out of their way to make a cool little detail that not many people were going to see. Then also in the lobby here, in the corner is the stand for the VCR player, and if we take the camera below it, we can see two more of them just stacked up here. I guess the developers just forgot to delete these. Kind of weird. What's even weirder though in the main foyer is what's seen if we take the camera just below the two posters going down each of the two side hallways here. Under both of these are some hidden creepy pictures of various people with their faces all scribbled out. Now, I haven't seen anyone else talk about these, so I'm not sure if they're part of some side Easter egg or anything. But yeah, they just all appear to be staff photos or something. I'm not sure if these are pictures of the devs or employees of Playtime Co., but regardless, seeing their faces maliciously scribbled out like this is really unsettling. Then moving along to this main hub-like area where you first encounter the large ugly fellas, there are several doors that we normally never get to enter. Although the power door leads to another room, I know when playing this chapter for the first time myself, I was really curious as to what was behind the ugly theater and here's the door. Well, to my disappointment, unfortunately there's not much at all behind these doors. Each one just contains a small empty room with the theater room curiously being the largest. But there is a room behind these doors though, which is more than I can say for some stuff we'll see later in this video. So perhaps there once was a plan to use these doors. Also, there's not much behind the innovation room with the big door, but we do at least get to see where the conveyor belt thing from the room ends up going. Next, when moving on from this room, you can see Huggy Wuggy's arms slither away as you walk down this corridor. I was curious to see how this was done, and I thought it was just going to be a model of the arm, but to my surprise, Huggy Wuggy actually is standing behind the door in a menacing T-pose. So menacing that he's like slipping through several walls. But yeah, it's pretty interesting to see that the developers just slapped him in here and just animated his arm for the effect. Next oddity I found was in this room where after you drop the second grab pack hand, for some reason a duplicate of it can be seen found under the floor. Even after you grab the second hand, this duplicate still remains
We're done.
there.
I'm
Pretty
done
strange.
today. Let's hide
Also
off.
around here under the floor
Later.
is this weird glass thing being supported by a stand or something. Not really sure where